It was a sunny Friday afternoon when Aaron Green parked his modest white van outside an upscale suburban neighborhood. As a delivery driver, Aaron was used to the monotonous routine, grabbing packages, scanning them, and dropping them off at doorsteps. But something about this neighborhood always felt different. Eyes seemed to linger a little too long, and doors would crack open just enough for someone to peek out as he walked by. Aaron, dressed in his usual work uniform, a blue shirt with the company logo and khaki pants, grabbed the next package from the van. It was lightweight, wrapped neatly in brown paper, addressed to 1642 Willow Lane. He glanced at the house numbers as he walked, muttering to himself, 1606, 1610, almost there. As he approached the house, a patrol car slowly cruised down the street. Aaron noticed it in his peripheral vision, but paid no mind. He had a job to do and no time to spare. He reached the doorstep, rang the bell, and placed the package carefully in the designated spot. Before he could return to the van, the patrol car had stopped. Two officers emerged, their gazes locked on Aaron. "Hey you, stop right there," one of them barked. Aaron froze mid-step, puzzled but not surprised. Encounters like these weren't new to him. Turning slowly, he raised his hands slightly, palms out. "Is there a problem, officers?" The taller officer, a middle-aged man with a buzz cut and a scowl that seemed permanently etched into his face, stepped forward. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" "Delivering a package," Aaron replied calmly, gesturing toward the house behind him. The second officer, younger and visibly less experienced, glanced at the package but said nothing. The older cop wasn't convinced. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area." "You fit the description." Aaron raised an eyebrow. "The description of a delivery driver in uniform?" The older officer's jaw tightened. "Watch your tone. Let me see some ID." Aaron sighed, pulling out his work badge and state-issued ID. "Here you go. My name's Aaron Green. I work for Swift Courier." The officer scrutinized the IDs for a moment before tossing them back. "Mind if we take a look inside your van?" "Yes, I do mind," Aaron said firmly. "Without a warrant, you have no right to search my vehicle." The officer's scowl deepened. "Refusing a lawful request, huh? You've got nothing to hide, right? So, what's the problem?" Before Aaron could respond, the officer grabbed his arm. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." "Wait, what are you doing?" Aaron protested. "You're being detained for suspicion of theft and obstruction of an investigation," the officer replied coldly, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Aaron's heart raced, but his expression remained stoic. He had expected this, though it didn't make the situation any less infuriating. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Aaron warned, his voice calm but edged with authority. The officer smirked. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" Aaron didn't answer. Not yet. He knew this wasn't the right moment. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Aaron's gaze didn't waver. Inside, he was already strategizing. This wasn't just about him. This was about exposing something much bigger. Aaron was led to the patrol car, his wrists tightly bound by the cold steel of the cuffs. Neighbors peeked through their blinds or stepped out onto their porches, murmuring to one another. Aaron noticed their whispers and shaking heads but kept his composure. He had prepared for this moment. Though he hadn't anticipated it happening today, the younger officer, clearly uneasy, hesitated before opening the back door of the patrol car. Should we really?" The older officer silenced him with a glare. "We're doing our job, rookie. Don't start questioning me now." Aaron remained silent, watching the rookie closely. There was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a glimmer of someone who still wrestled with their conscience. Aaron filed that detail away for later. The ride to the station was uneventful, save for the occasional comment from the older officer. "Guys like you always think you can get away with anything." "Not on my watch," he muttered, glancing at Aaron through the rearview mirror. Aaron didn't respond, opting instead to observe. He knew that silence often spoke louder than words. At the station, he was ushered into a small windowless room with a metal table and two chairs. The older officer gestured for him to sit. "Wait here. Don't move," he said before leaving the room. Aaron sat calmly, his posture relaxed, his eyes scanning the room. He noted the placement of the camera in the corner and the subtle hum of the air conditioning. Every detail mattered. Minutes later, the older officer returned, accompanied by another man in plain clothes. This man was clearly higher up the chain, a detective, judging by his demeanor and the way he carried himself. So, the detective began. sitting across from Aaron and folding his hands on the table. Care to tell us what you were doing in that neighborhood? Aaron leaned back slightly. I already told the officers. I was delivering a package. The detective raised an eyebrow. And yet, here you are, sitting in cuffs in an interrogation room. Something doesn't add up. Aaron tilted his head. What doesn't add up? That I was doing my job? Or that you're wasting time on this instead of investigating actual crimes? The older officer standing by the door crossed his arms and smirked. This one's got a smart mouth. The detective ignored the comment. Let's cut to the chase, Mr. Green. We've had reports of theft in that area. Packages going missing. You being there raises questions. Aaron's expression remained neutral. Questions that could have been answered by looking at the package I delivered. Did anyone bother to check the tracking number? The detective paused, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face. He glanced at the officer by the door, who shrugged. We're investigating all possibilities, the detective said, regaining his composure. If you cooperate, this will go a lot smoother for you. Aaron leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. And if I don't? What's the plan, detective? Keep me here for hours, hoping I'll confess to something I didn't do? The tension in the room was palpable. The detective shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to being challenged so directly. Aaron's voice softened, but his words were deliberate. You're digging yourself into a hole. The longer this goes on, the worse it's going to look when the truth comes out. The detective frowned. What truth is that? Aaron's lips curled into a small, enigmatic smile. You'll find out soon enough. Before the detective could respond, the door opened and a sergeant entered the room, looking flustered. Detective, a word? The detective rose, shooting Aaron a suspicious glance before stepping out into the hallway. Left alone with the older officer, Aaron leaned back in his chair, his demeanor unshaken. The officer sneered. You think you're real clever, don't you? Aaron finally broke his silence with a chuckle. Clever enough to know you've just made the worst mistake of your career. The officer's smirk faltered slightly. But he didn't respond. The detective re-entered the room, his expression a mixture of confusion and unease. He carried a file in his hand, one he hadn't brought in before. He sat down across from Aaron, tapping the edge of the folder against the table as if trying to decide how to proceed. So, Mr. Green, the detective began, his tone slightly less confident than before. You're not exactly who you appear to be, are you? Aaron leaned forward, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Took you long enough? The detective opened the file, revealing a photograph and several sheets of paper. Aaron Green, federal judge, appointed 2 years ago to the Eastern District Court. Is that correct? The older officer by the door stiffened, his arms dropping to his sides. What? He muttered, his voice barely audible. Aaron crossed his arms, his expression calm, but resolute. That's correct. And right now, you're detaining me unlawfully, but I'm not surprised. This department has a reputation, doesn't it? The detective's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. He shot a sharp look at the officer by the door, who was now visibly sweating. Step outside, the detective barked. The officer hesitated, glancing between the detective and Aaron. But now, the detective snapped. The officer left, closing the door behind him. Aaron waited patiently, his calm demeanor never faltering. The detective sighed, rubbing his temples. Judge Green, I'm not sure how to explain this. Oh, I think you'll find the words, Aaron replied smoothly. I'd suggest starting with an apology. The detective swallowed hard. This is all a misunderstanding. My officer was responding to reports of suspicious activity in the neighborhood. Aaron raised a hand, cutting him off. Save it. I know exactly what this is. Your officer saw a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood and made assumptions. Let's not insult each other's intelligence by pretending otherwise. The detective's face flushed. I assure you, that's not the case. Aaron's gaze hardened. Isn't it? Because from where I'm sitting, it sure looks like racial profiling. And that's exactly why I'm here. The detective frowned. What do you mean? Why you're here? Aaron leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly but carrying an undeniable authority. I've been investigating this department for months. Reports of misconduct, excessive use of force, and, you guessed it, racial profiling. This wasn't just a delivery. It was a test. And congratulations, detective. You failed. The detective's eyes widened as realization dawned. You set this up? Aaron tilted his head. Not exactly. I simply created a scenario to see how your officers would respond. The rest? That was all on you. The room fell into a tense silence. The detective stared at Aaron, his mind racing as he tried to process the situation. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Judge Green, I assure you, we take these matters very seriously. If there's been any wrongdoing..." Aaron cut him off again. "There's no if. Your officer detained me without cause, made baseless accusations, and violated my rights. And from what I've seen, that behavior is part of a larger pattern in this department. This ends now." The detective sat back in his chair, visibly shaken. "What do you intend to do?" Aaron's gaze was steely. "You'll find out soon enough. But first, I expect an immediate release and a full report of this incident. And trust me, detective, this won't go unnoticed." The detective nodded slowly, realizing there was no way out but to comply. As the door opened and the sergeant re-entered with an uneasy expression, Aaron remained seated, his composed demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos he'd just unleashed. Aaron stepped out of the interrogation room, his presence now commanding the attention of every officer in the precinct. Conversations halted, eyes turned, and whispers spread through the station like wildfire. To most of the officers, he was just a delivery driver moments ago. Now, the realization of his true identity hit them like a tidal wave. Detective Harris followed closely behind, his usual confidence replaced with a cautious demeanor. He gestured toward the sergeant, who hurried to open the door leading out of the precinct. "Judge Green will ensure this incident is reviewed immediately," Harris said, his tone carefully measured. Aaron paused, his sharp gaze scanning the room. He didn't raise his voice, but it carried across the precinct with ease. "This station is a reflection of a much deeper problem. What happened today isn't an isolated incident, and I'm here to ensure it stops. Starting now." An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, some visibly fidgeting under Aaron's piercing stare. "You," Aaron continued, pointing at Officer Daniels, the man who had initiated the arrest. Daniels stiffened, his face pale. "What's your badge number?" Daniels stammered. 6482, sir." Aaron nodded, pulling a small notepad from his pocket. He jotted the number down deliberately, his movements slow and precise. "Officer Daniels, do you know why I was in that neighborhood?" Daniels shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. No, sir. I was delivering a legal summons," Aaron said, his tone firm. "In my line of work, I visit neighborhoods of every kind, but instead of doing your job properly, you saw my skin color and assumed I didn't belong. That stops today." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but seemed to think better of it. Opting instead to lower his gaze to the floor, Aaron turned back to Detective Harris, who stood rigidly by the door. "You have a choice, detective. You can acknowledge the problem and be part of the solution, or you can continue to look the other way. But let me be very clear. Change is coming, with or without your cooperation." Harris nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll cooperate, Judge Green. I promise you that." Aaron's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "I'll hold you to it." As he stepped outside, the cold evening air hit his face. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. Behind him, the precinct remained eerily silent, the tension palpable even from the sidewalk. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. A familiar voice answered on the second ring. "This is Agent Carter." "Carter, it's Aaron," he said. "I've got what we need." There was a brief pause on the other end. "They took the bait?" "Oh, they took it," Aaron confirmed. "And now we have a first-hand account to back up the reports. I'll be filing my complaint with the Civil Rights Division tonight. Make sure the media is ready." Carter chuckled. "I'll start drafting the press release. This is going to shake them up." Aaron ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket. He began walking down the sidewalk, his mind already on the next steps. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but today had been a turning point. The system had failed for too long, and he was determined to hold it accountable. As he disappeared into the night, the officers inside the precinct were left to grapple with the aftermath of their actions. Change was no longer a distant possibility. It was an inevitability. The following morning, the precinct was abuzz with activity, but not for the usual reasons. The whispers had started as early as dawn, spreading like wildfire among the officers. Some tried to downplay the incident, calling it a misunderstanding, while others sat in uneasy silence, dreading the fallout they knew was inevitable. Detective Harris entered the station with heavy steps. The weight of the previous day lingered, and he could feel the eyes of his peers on him as he walked to his desk. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from city officials and internal affairs. Each message seemed more urgent than the last. He slumped into his chair, rubbing his temples. "This is bad," he muttered to himself. "Bad? It's a disaster," a voice said from across the desk. Sergeant Wilson, the station's longest-serving officer, stood there holding a cup of coffee. His usually calm demeanor was replaced with a tense scowl. Harris sighed. "Wilson, don't start. I'm already getting it from every direction." "You should be," Wilson said bluntly, taking a seat. "Do you realize what you've done? You arrested a federal judge on bogus charges. Do you have any idea how this is going to look?" Harris glared at him. "I didn't arrest him. Daniels did," Wilson scoffed. "And you let it happen. You're supposed to lead, Harris. Instead, you stood there and let your team make fools of all of us." Harris didn't respond. He stared at his desk, the enormity of the situation sinking in. Across town, Aaron sat in a conference room with his legal team. Stacks of documents were spread across the table, and a large screen displayed a map of the precinct's jurisdiction. At the head of the table was Agent Carter, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for taking on tough cases. "This is the moment we've been waiting for," Carter said, gesturing toward the map. "We've compiled years of complaints, dozens of witness statements, and now, thanks to yesterday, we have first-hand evidence. Judge Green's testimony will be the cornerstone of our case." Aaron nodded. "What's the status of the media outreach?" Carter smirked. "Already in motion. By noon, every major outlet will be running the story. And once the public gets wind of this, the department won't have a choice but to respond." One of the lawyers, a sharp-eyed woman named Rachel, interjected. "We need to be prepared for pushback. The department will claim it was an isolated incident. They'll say Daniels was acting alone, and Harris will distance himself. We need to prove this is systemic." Aaron leaned back in his chair, his expression resolute. "And we will. Yesterday was just the tip of the iceberg. This is about more than one bad cop. It's about an entire culture of discrimination. We'll expose it for what it is." Back at the precinct, Officer Daniels sat alone in a small office, his hands fidgeting nervously. He had been called in for a meeting with Internal Affairs, and the tension in the air was suffocating. The door opened, and two stern-faced investigators walked in, closing it behind them. "Officer Daniels," one of them began. "You're aware of why you're here?" Daniels nodded, his voice shaky. "Yes, sir." The investigator placed a recorder on the desk and pressed a button. "Let's start with your account of what happened yesterday." Daniels swallowed hard. He knew the truth could destroy his career, but lying would only make things worse. He took a deep breath and began recounting the events, his words a mix of justification and regret. As the interview progressed, Daniels realized there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. Every word he spoke seemed to tighten the noose around his neck. Meanwhile, Aaron's story began to dominate the news cycle. Headlines blared: "Federal judge detained in shocking case of racial profiling delivery driver. Turns out to be a judge. Investigating police misconduct. Systemic racism exposed in local police department." The public reaction was swift and intense. Protests began forming outside the precinct, with demonstrators holding signs demanding justice and accountability. The department was inundated with calls from concerned citizens, advocacy groups, and reporters seeking answers. Inside his office, Chief Monroe watched the news coverage with a grim expression. He had spent decades building the department's reputation, and now it was unraveling before his eyes. He picked up the phone and dialed Detective Harris. "Get in here," he barked. Harris arrived minutes later, his face pale. "Chief?" Monroe gestured toward the TV, where footage of the protests played on a loop. "Do you see this? This is what your team caused. I want this handled. Now." Harris nodded, his voice shaky. "Yes, sir." Monroe leaned forward, his eyes cold. "And Harris, if you can't fix this, I'll find someone who can." The storm was only beginning, and everyone involved was about to be swept up in its fury. By the time the sun set over the city, the precinct was drowning in chaos. Protesters had gathered in larger numbers outside, chanting slogans and waving signs. Reporters crowded near the entrance, shouting questions at every officer who dared to step outside. The air inside the station was just as tense, with officers glued to their screens, watching the story unfold. Meanwhile, in the conference room at the Federal Building, Aaron prepared for the next phase of the operation. He stood before a whiteboard covered with photos, documents, and timelines. His team sat around him, notebooks open and pens poised, ready to execute their roles. "Let's get one thing straight," Aaron began, his voice steady but firm. This isn't just about yesterday's incident. This is about decades of unchecked bias and abuse. Our job isn't just to expose it, it's to ensure it can't continue. Agent Carter stepped forward, handing out files to the team. We've compiled a list of officers with repeated complaints against them. We'll start with Daniels, but Harris and the rest of his team are next. Every arrest, every stop, every complaint, they're all under review. Aaron nodded. The department will try to sweep this under the rug, but we won't let them. By the time we're done, they'll have no choice but to answer for their actions. Back at the precinct, Detective Harris sat in a meeting room with Chief Monroe and 2 representatives from Internal Affairs. The mood was oppressive, with the weight of impending scrutiny bearing down on everyone present. "Harris," Monroe said, his voice low and threatening, "you've put this department in the crosshairs of a federal investigation. Explain to me how this happened." Harris struggled to find the words. "Chief, it was a mistake. Daniels, he acted impulsively. None of us knew who the man really was." "Impulsively?" Monroe's voice rose. "You let your officers arrest a man for delivering a package. Where was the oversight? Where was the judgment?" One of the Internal Affairs officers interjected. "Chief, it's not just about this one incident. Judge Green has been investigating this department for over a year. His involvement suggests a pattern of behavior we can't ignore." Monroe's face darkened. "A pattern? Are you saying my department has been under federal surveillance?" "Yes," the officer replied. "And yesterday gave them the evidence they needed to escalate the case." The room fell silent as the gravity of the situation sank in. Meanwhile, Aaron sat in a quiet corner of a coffee shop reviewing the footage from the previous day. He had watched it several times, each replay sharpening his resolve. The camera in his delivery van had captured every moment, from Daniels's initial approach to the tense exchange at the precinct. As he sipped his coffee, his phone buzzed. It was Agent Carter. "Judge Green," Carter said, "we've uncovered something you need to see. Daniels's personnel file has multiple complaints of misconduct, most of which were dismissed without investigation." Aaron frowned. "Dismissed? By who?" "The chain of command," Carter replied. "It looks like Harris has been shielding him and others like him for years." Aaron's jaw tightened. "Then we start with Harris. If he's been covering for his officers, he's just as guilty as they are." The protests outside the precinct continued into the night, the crowd growing louder and more determined. Inside, Officer Daniels sat in an interrogation room, his confidence eroding with each passing hour. 2 Internal Affairs investigators faced him, their questions relentless. "Officer Daniels," one of them said, "you've been accused of racial profiling before. Why weren't those cases investigated?" Daniels shifted uncomfortably. I don't know. That's above my pay grade." The second investigator leaned forward. "You don't know? Or you don't want to say? Because it looks like someone's been protecting you." Daniels remained silent, his gaze fixed on the table. Outside the room, Harris watched through the glass, his stomach churning. He had always believed in loyalty, but now that loyalty was threatening to destroy everything he had worked for. In the federal building, Aaron and his team prepared their next move. They had enough evidence to confront Harris directly, and they knew time was of the essence. With the media spotlight shining brightly, the department was vulnerable and any delay could give them a chance to regroup. As Aaron gathered his files, Rachel approached him. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. Aaron's expression was resolute. "I've been ready for this my whole life." The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the foundation of the department and force its darkest secrets into the light. By the time Aaron arrived at the precinct the next morning, the tension in the air was palpable. Protesters had swelled to hundreds, their chants a rhythmic drumbeat of justice that reverberated through the streets. Officers stood behind barricades, their faces a mix of unease and defiance, as news cameras captured every detail for a growing national audience. Inside, Chief Monroe paced his office, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Detective Harris stood by the window, staring out at the crowd. "They're not leaving," Harris muttered. Monroe shot him a glare. "And they won't until we address this mess. You're the one who let this get out of hand, Harris. Now we're all paying the price." Before Harris could respond, a sharp knock interrupted them. An officer opened the door and announced, "Judge Aaron Green is here to see you." Monroe's eyes widened, his jaw tightening. "Show him in." Aaron stepped into the office, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing beneath the surface. He carried a briefcase in one hand and a folder in the other, both symbols of the weight he carried into this meeting. Judge Green, Monroe began, forcing a smile. I understand you've brought some concerns to our attention. Aaron didn't sit. Instead, he placed the folder on Monroe's desk and opened it, revealing a stack of documents. Concerns would be an understatement, Chief. What I've brought are facts, documented evidence of systemic racial profiling, misconduct, and cover-ups within your department. Monroe glanced at the papers but didn't touch them. And what exactly do you intend to do with this evidence? Aaron's gaze was unflinching. What I intend to do, Chief, is ensure that justice is served. But before we get to that, I want to give you and your officers a chance to cooperate. This can either be a partnership or a confrontation. The choice is yours. Harris scoffed from the corner. You think you can walk in here and lecture us about how to do our jobs? Aaron turned to face him, his expression steely. Your job, Detective Harris, is to uphold the law, not manipulate it. Yet your record suggests otherwise. Harris bristled but remained silent. Monroe cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. Judge Green, this department is under intense scrutiny right now. We're willing to work with you, but we need time to address these issues internally. Aaron shook his head. Time is a luxury your department can't afford. Every day that passes without accountability is another day these officers continue to harm the very community they're supposed to protect. The tension in the room was suffocating. Monroe finally broke the silence. What exactly are you proposing? Aaron pulled another document from his briefcase. A full federal audit of your department, starting immediately. Independent oversight during the process. And most importantly, the suspension of officers with multiple complaints of misconduct until the investigation is complete. Monroe's face turned red. You're asking me to dismantle my own department. Aaron leaned forward, his voice firm. I'm asking you to fix it before it's too late. Meanwhile, outside the precinct, the protesters' chants grew louder. Among them was Darnell, the young man who had captured Aaron's arrest on video. He held his phone high, live streaming the crowd's energy to thousands of viewers. This isn't just about one man, Darnell said into the camera. This is about all of us. Every person who's been stopped, harassed, or worse just because of the color of their skin. Judge Green is giving us a chance to fight back, and we need to stand with him. Inside the precinct, Monroe finally nodded. Fine. We'll cooperate. But if this backfires, it won't, Aaron interrupted. Because transparency and accountability never do. As he left the office, Aaron felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. This was just the beginning of a long, grueling process, but it was a step in the right direction. Walking back through the precinct, he noticed the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. Officers whispering nervously, glances filled with uncertainty. He knew change wouldn't come easily, but for the first time, it felt possible. As he exited the building, the crowd erupted into cheers. Aaron raised a hand, acknowledging their support before stepping into his car. This is far from over, he murmured to himself, determination lighting his eyes. The days following Aaron's confrontation with the precinct marked the beginning of a seismic shift. The federal audit was announced, and investigators swarmed the department, poring over records, interviewing officers and civilians, and uncovering years of buried misconduct. The media spotlight intensified, broadcasting every development to a nation eager to see justice served. Aaron worked tirelessly, balancing his responsibilities as a federal judge with his role as an advocate for reform. He met with community leaders, attended town halls, and engaged directly with the people who had been most affected by systemic injustice. One of those voices was Darnell, whose video had gone viral. Aaron invited him to join a civilian oversight committee tasked with monitoring the department's progress. You've already made a difference, Aaron told him. Now, let's make it permanent. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere had transformed. Officers like Detective Harris found themselves under intense scrutiny. Complaints once ignored were now reopened, and those found guilty of misconduct faced suspension or termination. For Chief Monroe, the process was humbling. During a press conference, he stood beside Aaron and admitted, "We failed our community, but with Judge Green's leadership, we're committed to earning back your trust." It was a powerful moment, but Aaron knew words weren't enough. Actions had to follow. Months passed, and the first signs of change began to appear. The precinct implemented mandatory bias training, revamped hiring practices to prioritize diversity, and established a permanent civilian review board. Aaron attended the graduation ceremony of a new class of recruits, officers trained under the department's revised standards. As he watched them take their oaths, he felt a spark of hope. One recruit, a young black woman named Lila, approached him afterward. "Your story inspired me to join," she said. "I want to be part of the solution." Aaron smiled, encouraged by her determination. "It's people like you who will make the difference," he said. Aaron's efforts resonated far beyond the precinct. Other departments across the country began adopting similar reforms, and the movement for accountability gained momentum. Darnell's oversight committee became a model for community engagement, and he emerged as a prominent advocate for justice. "This isn't just about fixing one department," he said during an interview. "It's about changing the system." Aaron, too, found himself at the forefront of a national conversation. But he remained grounded, always returning to the community that had supported him. One evening, as he walked through his neighborhood, a delivery driver approached him. The man hesitated, then said, "I saw what you did. You stood up for all of us." Aaron clasped the man's shoulder. "I didn't do it alone. And the work isn't finished." Aaron's journey from being unjustly detained to spearheading systemic reform became a symbol of resilience and justice. His story inspired countless others to challenge prejudice, fight for equality, and demand accountability. As the sun set over the city, Aaron stood on the courthouse steps, reflecting on the long road ahead. He knew the battle for justice was far from over, but he also knew that every step forward brought them closer to a world where no one would be judged by the color of their skin. And with that thought, he turned and walked inside, ready to continue the fight.